Today, we've got Kelly Feehan with us from Platte County. Is that where
Correct.
Columbus is?
Mhm.
So out of Columbus and oversees a handful of counties for us and does a great job. Today we're learning about rain gardens and where you might be able to put one in your yard and what good plants are go into those to help mitigate some of those water runoff issues that you might be having.
Thank you,
That might be
Ian.
it. Yeah,
Thank
take it
you.
away, Kelly.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. Yes, last year for GroBigRed, whether you attended or not, but I did a program on rainwater harvesting. So just all the general methods that you can use to harvest the rain, and rain gardens was one of them that I talked about briefly. So this one is a little bit different angle. This is, what it says, where to use a rain garden and what to plant in them. And I'm not going to go into installation or anything like that, maybe a couple of points here and there if it affects plants. But we'll just dive in with these two topics. So briefly, for anybody new to rain gardens, a rain garden is a garden planted in a shallow depression, or what we often refer to as a basin. And they typically have low berms on three sides. And the berms are just kind of there to help create that basin, as well as hold in the rainwater when it rains. They're located and designed to catch and soak in rainwater in 24 to 48 hours. We don't want water standing in these any longer than 48 hours and ideally 24 hours. And to make that happen, you need to size and install them correctly, which I'm not going to get into today, but I will tell you where you can get information on that. And they're typically planted with deep-rooted perennials, ornamental grasses. If they're large enough, we can use shrubs as well. And I'll get into some of those plants in the latter half. So this is a rain garden. So as you can see, this is what it should look like right after a rainfall. And that kind of makes people nervous when they see that standing water there. But again, if it's sized and designed correctly, that water is gone in 48 hours and usually typically 24 hours. So rain gardens they're not water gardens, bogs, or ponds. Okay, that standing water is only there for a brief period of time. They're not mosquito breeding grounds, which we hear people say, why would I want to plant a mosquito breeding pond? Mosquitoes require 7 to 12 days of standing stagnant water from about egg hatch or egg stage to the adult stage. So if the rain garden with the water's gone in less than 48 hours, there's not enough time for that development. And they might even be mosquito traps. So the eggs are laid in that water and then it drains, dries out, and the larvae dies. We can't say it's definitely that, but we could say it could be. So why would you want a rain garden? Well, they help us make most of rainfall when we do receive it. I often hear people say, why use rain gardens? We hardly ever get rain in Nebraska. Well, that makes it even more important that we, rather than having it run off, especially in urban areas where a lot of times the downspouts directed to the driveway, to the street, to the storm drain, out of town as fast as possible. This just helps us capture and infiltrate some of that and just make the most of it when we actually do receive it. And that helps reduce that stormwater runoff, which leads to reduction of water pollution. So stormwater runoff carries a number of things to those streams and rivers and lakes. So it helps reduce that. We can conserve water for capturing and infiltrating more rainwater. Most rain gardens are designed with average rainfall. They don't need additional irrigation. And then just all the reasons we plant gardens, they beautify the landscape, increase plant diversity, and can help attract and support pollinators and songbirds and so on. So where do you want to put them? Selecting a location for a rain garden. Where will the rainwater come from? There has to be a source of the rainwater. It's typically a downspout, but it can just be the upslope area of a lawn, and I'll show some pictures for examples. It might be an impervious surface, which is a little bit harder. Most impervious surfaces are designed so that water will run into the street and so on, but there are some situations where that could work. And I say consider all sources. What I mean by that is to size a garden correctly, you have to identify the surface area that, the square footage of the area that's going to be draining to it. So a lot of times people think, well, all the water is going to come from my downspout. So they estimate the surface area of their roof but there might be rainwater flowing in from another area, such as an impervious surface or upslope. So you kind of need to evaluate it and make sure you're considering all the sources to make sure you size it correctly. So you want to be thinking about how will the rainwater get into the rain garden? And will that work naturally and easily? So again, will it be a downspout? Will it just be natural flow? Could be an underground pipe, and I'll show some examples. And is the soil well drained? This is critical for rain gardens, okay, along with sizing correctly and having the right depth. They must be in an area that's well drained. And I've heard people tell me in the past, well, I have a great place for a rain garden. Every time it rains, the water runs there and it just sits there and it pools. That might be the worst place for a rain garden, unless you do some soil work to improve infiltration and drainage. So, the location should not be a traffic area. We want minimal traffic in a rain garden. I tell anymore, not only for rain gardens, but I encourage everybody in their landscapes to do a soil percolation test. And I'll explain how to do that, just so you have an idea of how well drained your soil is. But it is critical and especially important in a rain garden. Full sun is ideal because we can choose a lot more plants, and a lot of our native perennials that have really good deep roots, a lot of them are full sun plants. It can be shade, but like any shade, it's going to limit what you can plant in there. And we do want to consider those trees because you are excavating the soil. You are digging down in a residential rain garden. You're probably going to be digging anywhere from 8 to more than 12 inches deep. And that if there's nearby trees, it's going to have an impact on those trees. So I know in my picture here, when we installed this rain garden, there was a maple tree there. We knew we were going to cause problems for that maple tree, but this was a public site in a park. And they were having some troubles with this tree anyway. But as you can see, that tree is now gone. It only took about 2 to 3 years in this case. So that excavating around those trees is pretty tough on them. So evaluate, I said, do that soil percolation test. It's pretty easy to do. You just kind of dig a hole that's 6 to 10 inches deep, fill it with water. And you can do 2 things. You can put a yardstick down in there and you can monitor it. Check it about once an hour. The minimum for a rain garden is a 1/4 inch per hour. Okay. Ideal is 1/2 inch to 1 inch. Or an easier thing to do is just fill that hole with water. In 24 hours, go and check it. And if it's gone, you're probably good. And then if it's not gone, check it again in maybe 36 and then 48 hours or whatever's feasible. It should be gone after 48 hours. If there's still water standing in it after that, there would be concerns for that site. And you want to check the middle as well as the ends of the rain gardens, especially the larger the rain garden. You might want to do more than 1 percolation test. So getting rainwater into the garden, that's an important part of the location. You want to make sure that's going to be convenient or feasible and will work. So typically, it is just by a downspout by the house. Okay. Anytime you have a rain garden where you have the rainwater coming in from one specific point, like a downspout, you're going to have to use some kind of soil armor. So this is kind of a scour mesh that's available that you can put under that downspout, or you can use rocks and stones and so on, which might be a little bit more ornamental. It can be an extension of a foundation planting. So put it next to that foundation planting that's already there, and then just extend those downspouts out just a little bit further. That can work. I have a picture here. A lot of times people will kind of have an island of a rain garden, and that's okay. It's not ideal design. And the other problem with this extension here is it's a tripping hazard. You have to remove it every time you mow. If you're willing to do that, that's okay. But take that into consideration. So sometimes this will work, is more convenient. We do frequently say that rain gardens should be about 10 feet away from your foundation. And I do have that in a later slide. And that's probably why they started doing this. The original, when they came out, it was be 10 feet from your foundation, just so we don't have some leakage possibly into the basement. I see a lot of rain gardens that are closer than 10 feet. But I guess it would depend on your soil and your foundation and things such as that. You can go from a downspout through a rain barrel. So this is Prairie Loft in Hastings. And you can see there's rain barrels attached to the downspout, and then this one fills up, and this one fills up, and then the rainwater comes out here into the rain garden. And you just, that way, again, double rainwater harvesting. You're also collecting rainwater to use for watering container plants and things such as that. You can create a swale. This was in the forefront here is the rain garden. It was quite a ways away from the downspout, and they didn't want an extension that long. So this is one of my master gardeners, and we were installing one, and he just kind of created a swale, which is just kind of a bowl shape, just an indentation in the lawn. But we cut out the sod, and then they went a little bit deeper, created the swale, and then he put the sod back. And then when it rained, then the downspout, it ran down here to the rain garden. You can just use natural flow from a slope. This was a rain garden in Norfolk, and as you can see, there's quite a bit of slope on this property, a large surface area, so this was a very large rain garden, as was necessary. This is just a little bit smaller one, and again, you have some natural slope here, so use your topography to advantage when you can. You can use an underground pipe if the rain garden is a little ways away. So this is a high school in Omaha and a greenhouse, and this is their rain garden, which is actually a pollinator garden too, and it's shaped like a butterfly. But you can see these two downspouts, and it just goes into kind of this grid pattern, and then there's a pipe underground that takes it over to the rain garden where it daylights right there. And you can see there's some soil armor there. So, and one more example of an underground pipe. So again, these are kind of a bubbler. This one, instead of this rocks and so on, they have just kind of a bubbler that the water kind of bubbles up and out into the rain garden. So that can kind of reduce that flow and erosion as well. Key location points, obviously what I've just said, where rainwater will flow into it, you can conveniently direct it into it. Soil needs to be well drained and not too close to trees and most ideally. Other things that in general, we say 10 foot from the house is ideal. Although as I'll say again, I've seen a lot of them that are closer to the home, but I suppose you might be concerned if we have really, really wet years, some possibility of seepage. Downslope of the home, you want to make sure the rain garden, it isn't tilted, the soil isn't going to be sloped towards the home, or you could have some issues there. 25 to 35 feet from a septic system drain field, about 50 feet from drinking water wells. These are just kind of some general things and ideal things. Utility lines, make sure you call, what is it, 100 dig? I can't remember the name of it anymore. And that water table at least 2 feet below soil. A gentle slope, about less than 12% is ideal. They're just a little bit easier to install. But I've seen them put on, I do have one picture where they're put on a much steeper slope. And then of course, considers rights of way, those underground lines and utilities ordinances, city ordinances, and then any HOA rules that might impact or affect how you're installing it. So that's kind of where to put them. We'll move on to plant selection, the fun part. If anybody has any questions, I see I don't know if that's people introducing themselves in the chat. Probably, but you guys can let me know if there's a question you want me to, thanks, 811, thank you. If there's a question you want me to answer as we go along, let me know. Otherwise, you can answer them if you want to, and so on. But feel free to type in some questions. So plant selection is like any garden, obviously. It needs to be adapted to the site, whether it's soil, which all rain garden soil should be pretty much the same. They might not be. There are still sandy loams. There are still some clayey ones that are used then they use organic matter added to them or compost to improve drainage along with some tillage. They obviously aesthetic, you like them, not a problem plant or an invasive plant. And like all plants, you want to consider that height, bloom time, and color and texture. Sorry, whenever I do chat, then it won't let me do my advancer. The difference with rain gardens is there's 3 distinct moisture zones, or 2 typically, but the top of the berm is going to be fairly dry, especially if you're not planning to irrigate, the sides of the berm, and then the bottom of the berm, at the bottom of the basin. Okay, and any plants put in there need to be able to tolerate those brief periods of pooling water or inundation, followed by possibly dry periods. Again, if not planning to irrigate. So I like to often say a lot of our native plants, they grow in ditches, our native wildflowers, because that's what happens in ditches. They get some inundation and then they go long periods of drought. So that's why some of our native plants make great plants. In the top of the berm is going to be fairly dry conditions again. So we need to take that into consideration, which you don't typically have to with most gardens. And again, the reason we want those deep-rooted plants is those deep roots help increase infiltration. So roots are always growing, they're dying, they're regrowing. So they're kind of almost working the soil with roots. And over time in a rain garden, that infiltration increases. So where it may take a little more than 24 hours or even 48 hours to drain, if you're using the right plants, over time, you're not walking in your rain garden a lot and compacting the soil, over time, that infiltration rate actually increases. And those deeper rooted plants are going to filter some of those pollutants that are going in there. What would be pollutants? It might be bacteria from bird poop on the roof. Sometimes our gutter systems we can get and roofing material, zinc would be an example. It's pretty minimal and we aren't too concerned about it in a residential rain garden site over time. But those are things that would need to be filtered out, and deep rooting helps that. So just another thing on plant selection is, remember, like any garden, tall plants can appear a little bit weedy and they might lodge, especially with wet soils and inundation. So on the left-hand side here, this was a church in Kansas City that had this two series of rain gardens. And you can see those tall plants, they were using Joe Pye weed, the species, which can get 7 feet or even taller here in this picture. And they can just sometimes look a little bit weedy. And this was the picture where I told you it was a very steep slope. And so what they did is they put in 2 rain gardens. So they had to level it off. The bottom of a rain garden has to be leveled. The bottom of the rain garden cannot be sloped. So when this one filled up with rainwater, then the rainwater flows out here into the next rain garden. So there is a way on location-wise, if you really want to put one in where there's a fairly steep slope, that's an example of how that could be done. So plants, a lot of times when talking to people about plants, it's easier to say what to avoid, because there's so many great plants out there that you could use. So this list comes from Steve Rohde, who is a extension specialist that worked a lot with rain gardens, and Andy Satko, who had been a landscape designer that did a lot of installed rain gardens. And then he now works for the city of Omaha, but he had worked with the stormwater program and had helped the city install rain gardens then. So this is kind of from their experience. I think some of it, like the purple poppy mallow and the wild petunia, they probably like it too well and spread a little bit too much. Horsetail rush, obviously that one can really become a nuisance. I will say we have a neb guide on plants to use in rain gardens, and horsetail rush is on there, but we did that in the early days and we've since had a lot more experience and learned that there are some things on that list that, yeah, they're kind of a problem. White turtlehead, pink turtlehead is wonderful. White turtlehead, I think it's just kind of hit or miss. A lot of times they didn't have much success with it. Okay, so plants for the bottom of the rain garden. And these are plants that will tolerate probably 6 to 12 or more inches of inundation. Again, that 24 hours is ideal, but most of them will do okay with the 48 hours. So obviously the sedges, the calyxes, they're kind of the foundation plants of rain gardens, especially on the bottom. Because that's in their native setting, that's where they grow. They grow in wet areas typically. They're smaller, they're about 1 to 3 feet tall, depending. There's so many of them available anymore, but depending on which one you get. Whereas a lot of our ornamental grasses get quite a bit taller, which is okay if you need that. But one nice thing about the sedges is that lower height. They have earlier growth in the spring than a lot of our warm season native grasses. So you get some color, they start to green up, they start to grow a little bit earlier. It's an advantage. And quite a few of them, once they're established, they are very tolerant of dry soil. So they still fit the bill for our rain garden plants in the bottom, tolerating that inundation and then tolerating periods of dry. Oh, I guess I should just say brown fox sedge here. This one, that's probably one of my favorites just for appearance. It almost looks more like a grass, and it's doing well in a chamber rain garden we have here in Columbus. Palm sedge is used a lot, but be aware this one does kind of spread. It'll spread in the rain garden. Sometimes it'll outcompete some of the other plants that you have in there. be aware of that. But it is used a lot in rain gardens.
Hey, Kelly,
Yep.
there's a question in the chat. Does gray sedge have burrs? In that picture, it kind of looked like
Yeah.
it had a burr on it.
It looks like burrs. Now, like I say, every time I hit, those look like burrs, but they're not really burrs. They're, I guess they're the fruiting body, the seed head of carex. But they're not pokey. They're not like a sand burr or a Texas puncture vine, if that's what you're concerned about. That's just kind of more the appearance of them. Okay, I don't know if there's another question. I might.
Yep, that was
Okay.
the one.
So some other bottom plants, of course, swamp milkweed, the milkweeds, I don't know about that name, swamp milkweed, but it gets that name because it does grow in wet areas. It's a native of Nebraska, so you sometimes see it growing in ditches, for example. This one blooms about midsummer. It's fairly tall, gets about 3 to 5 foot tall. It has a nice deep taproot like a lot of the milkweeds do. So that's a benefit for our rain gardens. It will get oleander aphids. Those are those bright yellow to orange aphids on the tips that it won't kill the plant. But sometimes it can affect the blooming or make those tips yellow a little bit. So just a heads up on that. Otherwise, it's doing great as a bottom plant in many rain gardens. Turtlehead, pink turtlehead or chelone. The one on the picture I have, that's from one of our rain gardens in Columbus. That's hot lips. The one on the top is rosea. Okay. And I like these. I really like these. Their foliage looks nice all season long up until when they freeze. They kind of slowly spread to fill in areas in the rain garden. You want rain garden plantings to be dense. Ideally, you won't be able to see the mulch when it gets fully mature. So you want them to be nice and dense. So I like that those chelone kind of slowly spreads, nicely spreads, and eventually covers up those areas. And it fairly long period of bloom. It says they'll get 2 to 3 feet tall, but this hot lips that we have, I don't think I've ever seen it get much taller than 1 foot to 1.5 feet. And they are native to swampy areas, but they do best if they do have some periods of dryness. Another one, my favorite of all, that Joe Pye weed, as you'd seen in that picture with the church, the species can get about 7 to 8 feet tall or even taller. So we do recommend Gateway and Little Joe, which are a little bit 3 to 4 feet. That's still pretty tall, but these are very upright, sturdy stems. I've never seen lodging with them. When they're blooming, they're just loaded with pollinators and about every type of pollinator you can imagine. This one will tolerate some part shade, but they bloom best in full sun. And they don't start blooming till later in the summer. Typically August is when they start to bloom. And go full glory late August through September and up till frost. Helenium, that's a common name as sneezeweed. That's not because it makes people sneeze. And I suppose you could be allergic to it, but it's mainly because the pioneers would dry those flowers and make a snuff out of it to make themselves sneeze because they thought it was healthy for them. And we all know what a good sneeze feels like. It does feel good. So, but this is a good one. There's different colors of helenium. There are some orange or some reddish ones as well. They can get pretty tall depending on which one that you get. They bloom later, August, September. This is one, if you pinch it up until June, because they're so multiple stemmed, if you pinch it till June, you'll have a nice, more compact, dense, and a lot more flowers. And it is one that they say you should divide fairly frequently. So just a warning with a rain garden, we want plants that we don't have to do a lot of that to, but helenium or sneezeweed does quite well in a rain garden, so we recommend it. And you don't have to pinch it, you don't have to divide it frequently, but it'll perform better if you do. So prairie blazing star, our liatris. So this particular species does well in the bottom of rain gardens. A lot of times people think of these as being, plants that grow out in the sandhills of Nebraska where it's very dry, and there are some species that grow are for that, but this particular one, prairie blazing star, does well in the bottom of the rain gardens. Gets 2 to 4 foot tall. There's not a lot of cultivars of this particular liatris, but Eureka is one of the common ones. It's been around for a while. Great pollinator plant as well. Now, Virginia mountain mint is probably a plant we don't see as much. We have this growing in a pollinator rain garden at the Central Community College here in Columbus, and it's doing well. And the name is, don't let the name confuse you, mountain mint. It's actually native to moist meadows, and it's not a mint. It's not a true mint, but it has that nice fragrant foliage, and that's where it gets the name mountain mint. So it is not a spreader. It's not going to become a nuisance, but it's an excellent pollinator plant as well, and it does well in the bottom of those rain gardens. It gets fairly tall. The ones up at CCC, most of them are probably 2 to 2.5 feet tall. Blooms that July to September, and again, you have that added benefit of that fragrant foliage if you work in it or work around it, or bruise it. Okay, lobelia or cardinal flower. This is one. It can be somewhat short-lived. It is shallow-rooted, so it doesn't necessarily have those deep roots, but it'll tolerate those wet conditions. This one, the red one, the cardinal flower they have growing in the Hastings rain garden. I've seen it there. I don't think it does as great as some of the other ones. It's short-lived. It might eventually die out, but it's still a great one to put in there for that color. People like it. The pink one on the left is Monet, that nice fuchsia, a very pretty one. So Monarda or bee balm is another plant that will tolerate the bottom or those wet sites. Although I kind of like this one better for the sides of the rain garden because it can get a little floppy. It can start to spread in really wet sites or moisture sites. And if you don't get the right cultivar, they do have a nasty problem with powdery mildew, and they'll look really tough or look really bad. So I kind of like them better for the side where it drains a little bit better. They're maybe not standing in water for that 24 to 48 hours. It doesn't stay as moist, but they will tolerate that if that's where you want to put them and you need them. So Marshall's Delight and Petite Delight are two that have great resistance to mildew. So those are the ones that we recommend. This is one that'll tolerate part shade, might not bloom quite as well, and you're more likely to have the mildew in the shade. I don't know, I see a lot of, I don't know if I stop and answer some questions or go on. Are you guys getting them answered?
Yeah, the big one that just popped in was me answering about
okay.
Seeds and things like that.
Good, great. Thank you so much. That way I can continue on. Okay, some other bottom plants. Golden Alexander. Now this is one, I don't know that I've actually ever seen this one growing. It's on every rain garden list I see. It's on every pollinator list I see. And it's one that blooms in May to June. So that's kind of a time period, the early spring blooming, our trees, our shrubs, some of our, our spring blooming bulbs, things like pasque flower, they're kind of wrapping up blooming. So it kind of blooms at a time when not a lot of other things are. And a lot of the summer blooming things haven't started yet. So that's another added benefit for it. It can tolerate part shade. It can, in ideal conditions, which would be a rain garden, it can reseed itself. I can't speak to that. If anybody else wants to pop something in the chat or say something, because I've never grown it myself or seen it, but they do say in ideal conditions, it can reseed pretty heavily. Siberian iris is a good one for the bottom. This picture is taken in a rain garden up at CCC here in Columbus. Okay, they can get 3 feet tall. Another one that blooms in May at a time when not a lot of other things are blooming. Tolerates, most of these plants that I have will tolerate drought. It might be kind of odd that I say it tolerates clay, but that usually means it'll tolerate wetter soils with a little bit lower oxygen, at least for periods of time. But we don't want to put any rain garden in a really heavy clay soil because of the drainage, unless you do some amendment. So Caesar's brother, this is the one on the right. I don't know if you guys, can you guys see are you seeing yourselves? Or is it just me? I did, because the picture of the gallery is covering up pictures. So if you guys can't see that, great. If only I can see it, that's great. But anyway, the picture on the right here is the Caesar's brother. If you're wondering what I mean by plant of merit, the Missouri Botanic Garden will name plants as being plants of merit, or for example, our great plants for the Great Plains in Nebraska. So that usually tells me it's probably a pretty decent plant. Siberian iris can be a little bit short-lived. I've found that to be the case compared to some of the other plants. And one nice thing about this is the foliage stays ornamental. Whereas, our bearded irises, sometimes that foliage gets a little ratty looking. A Siberian iris, that foliage will stay ornamental through most of the summer. Grasses, we do put grasses in our rain gardens. So Carl Forster feather reed grass is, maybe he's getting overplanted, but doesn't have any major issues with it or spread too readily. The seed is actually sterile. So it's a great one for rain gardens. It does need some division, otherwise you get that dead center, so you do have to go in there and do some dividing, but it's very easy to divide compared to some of our large native grasses, like switchgrass and so on, can be harder to divide. And a nice thing about Carl Forster, and the reason a lot of people like it, is it's a cool season grass, so it greens up earlier. In the spring, we have to wait a little longer on those warm season grasses, which is okay because they're beautiful for so long thereafter. And this one you get the plumes earlier. You don't have to wait till August, September to get the plumes. And they stay nice all winter long. Good winter interest. Switchgrass. So one of our native warm season grasses, does great, grows all through the sandhills and so on, but it does great on the bottom of our rain gardens, tolerates that inundation. So Dallas Blues, Shenandoah Heavy Metal, those are some good cultivars to use. This one can get, I don't have the height on it. Switchgrass is going to get at least 5 feet tall. So a large one. Okay, so tops and sides of the berm. Okay, and I combine these together because essentially the ones we say for the top, except for a few of them that I'll make note of, most of the top ones you can also put on the side, and actually most of the bottom ones you can put on the side as well. So, but geranium, this Roseanne, the cranesbill geranium, Roseanne is my favorite just because it blooms from June till frost. I have some other ones that, they only bloom May and June, and then they're finished for the year. They might look nice for the rest of the year, but there's no blooming. And sometimes the foliage can get a little floppy. They need to be cut back. Roseanne just stays this 1.5, 2 foot mound, and everyone I've seen or everyone I've grown blooms from June to frost. And it'll tolerate some drought. They'll bloom best if they get a little bit of shade, but if you're planting them where there's some taller grasses or so on, will shade them, they'll get that and bloom very nicely. Baptisia australis or blue false indigo. This one is another one. If you plant the species, it can get really tall. So we recommend the minor. And that one can still get about 3 feet tall. It blooms May, another one of those May bloomers when not much else is blooming, but it only blooms for about 1 week. But the blossoms are stunning when they're blooming. This one is very deep tap rooted, which is great for rain gardens, but once you plant it, you don't want to move it, or you can't move it, you'll kill it. And even though I have it listed for the top and the sides, this one is actually listed for the bottom of rain gardens as too. I've never seen it grown there to know how successful it'll be, but you could give it a try. So Wichita goldenrod is one listed for tops and sides, and Wichita Mountains is just one that we like. We have it growing in our Chamber of Commerce rain garden, and it does well there. So this one gets about kind of a nice long clusters. So 2 to 3 feet tall, blooms late summer into October, like the majority of the goldenrods. This one will tolerate drought, and it'll tolerate clay soil. So does okay in our rain gardens. The other liatris or dense blazing star. Now this one is actually listed for the bottom of rain gardens too, but I feel it does a little bit better and a little bit drier site. I don't think it tolerates that inundation as well as the prairie blazing star. August bloomer, though kobold is a cultivar that's been around for some time. Floristan violet as well. Thanks, I like the thumbs up. Gray-headed coneflower is another one. Like, again, if it's drought, we put them on top of the berm. Most of them, they're either going to tolerate dry soils or drought tolerant. Some of these native prairie plants, they actually do better because we tend sometimes to overwater our gardens. And when they're placed on top of those berms, excess water or rainfall even can kind of flow away. And they almost do better in some cases because they're not getting overwatered. So, but gray-headed coneflower, June to August, one of those perennials that's going to be a long season of bloom. So, and there's some different cultivars out there. I think this one, there are some that are reddish, I believe. Is it Mexican hat or something such as that? I'm drawing a blank, sorry. The alliums. There's some beautiful alliums out there. The Millennium was one of the perennial plants of the year not too long ago. But this nodding, excuse me, nodding onion, the one that's referred to as nodding onion because the clusters kind of hang down. It only gets about 1 to 2 feet tall, blooms June to August. So this is a allium that has a very long season of bloom, like the Millennium. And it too it'll tolerate drought. So it's good for the top of those berms. I'll give your ears a breather and my mouth a breather and take a drink. Okay, so the Rudbeckias. Some of the pictures I've shown of a rain garden we have in Pawnee Park outside of our football stadium, high school football stadium. You'll see that there's quite a bit of Rudbeckia growing there, doing great like Rudbeckias do. I'm pretty sure the one on the left here is Goldstrom. The one on the right is Viette's Little Susie. I included that one in there because I have master gardeners that are great. They know more about perennial flowers than I do. And I know this is a favorite of one of my master gardeners. So it's a little bit different one. We've been planting Goldstrom for a long time. Right in the picture, it may not look as dazzling because it's not as dense, but it has a little bit larger flower and a yellow flower. So long season of bloom, that's what a lot of people want. And they're tough plants. They'll tolerate drought as well as clay soil. Okay, asters, our New England aster. These are used in a lot of rain gardens, especially in Omaha. Most of them, they're either on the top of the berm, they're on the sides of the berm as well. When I say sides of the berm, I did want to mention the side, it needs to be a gentle slope. If the garden's large enough that you really have a pretty good side, it needs to be a gentle slope. We don't want it to look like a coffee cup, for example, a shallow coffee cup, or maybe even a cereal bowl. That would be too steep. So these are just very gentle slopes that you're using, that you're creating when you're designing and installing it. But New England aster, you have to get the right variety because some of these can get powdery mildew pretty nasty as well. Purple Dome is one that's performing well in the rain gardens. About 2 feet tall, it blooms pretty late, starts blooming fairly late in the summer, but it'll bloom through fall. And you can see it even in this picture, there's 2 pollinators at least there, and I think there's more. So it's an awesome pollinator plant as well. Butterfly milkweed. It's another great one, a nice good deep taproot. Once you plant it and it starts growing, make sure it's where you want it to stay because they're pretty tough to move because of that deep taproot. They start blooming. I'm impressed with this one because anytime I plant it, that first year, we always say with the perennials, that first year they don't do much, and the second year they start to bloom, and the third year they go to town. Mine looks great the first year, and the second year it goes to town. So the other thing, it tolerates drought, tolerates erosion. We recommend it for the top or the sides of the berm, but I will tell you there's a rain garden in Omaha where it's on the bottom, and it's actually been doing fine. A little bit odd. Maybe because it's a native of Nebraska and it grows, we don't see it growing in ditches, but at one time maybe more of it grew in ditches, and that's kind of the conditions you have with a rain garden. Periods of inundation followed by very dry periods. Okay, Guiam or prairie smoke is great. It's a nice low growing one. Sometimes for the tops of the berms, people want a little bit lower growing plants, especially if it's a smaller rain garden. So these only get 6 to 18 inches tall. Early bloomers bloom May into June. They will tolerate drought. I like mixing them in my garden. I like mixing them with pasque-flower because pasque-flower starts to bloom in April, and about the time they're kind of declining in their bloom, then the Guiams kind of bloom. They're both about the same height. The foliage kind of mixes nicely together, kind of create more of a ground cover type effect with them. And so that's just a combination that I like to create. So with pasque-flower will start blooming in April. And there's red ones, there's purple ones, there's lavender ones, there's red ones. Rubra is one of the red ones. I don't find it to be as vigorous as some of the others, but there is a red one out there if that's what you need. Of course, Guillaume has those smoky plumes. The seed head is that smoky plume, which doesn't, in mine, they don't last all summer, but they do last quite a while beyond the blooming. So ornamental grasses for the tops and sides of the berm. This year's great plants for the Great Plains ornamental grass is prairie blues, little blue stem, but any of the little blue stems would do fine. Another one that it can get 3 feet tall, especially when it's blooming. It's got its plumes on it. Prairie blues, you can see there's kind of that bluish green foliage, so very pretty foliage. It's our state grass. It's a tough grass, tolerates drought. It'll tolerate occasional inundation as well. So even though we recommend it for the top, if it's on the side and we get a heavier rainfall, which is kind of going forward, we're supposed to get fewer rainfalls, but when we do get them, they're supposed to be heavier. At least that could happen more often than it had in the past. So we have to account for that. So if prairie blues is in there, a little blue stem is planted on the side a little bit deeper, it'll tolerate that occasional inundation, which is an added advantage for it. Prairie dropseed is probably one of my favorite grasses for the tops of berms or just anywhere in the landscape where it's a little bit drier. Very light, airy, delicate. It's a nice arching mound until it starts, that only gets about 1.5 feet tall until it starts to bloom, and then those plumes are up to about 3 feet tall in August to September. It's a little bit slower to establish. This one takes usually a few years before it gets to size and you get a lot of blooming on it, but it's worth it. Very, very long lived. Nice, good drought tolerant one. Shrubs. We can use shrubs in the rain gardens. Usually you need a little bit larger rain gardens to use these in, but you can take that into consideration. I'm only going to mention 4, and the 4 that I mentioned will all grow on the bottom of a rain garden. So they'll all tolerate inundation for a brief period, and then the soils that tend to be a little bit wetter thereafter. So, and once it dries out, they're pretty good at tolerating those dry soils as well. So black chokeberry has been a common one, the aronia berry that's been around for a while. And the smaller one, like Autumn Magic, Iroquois Beauty, they'll stay a little bit smaller, 3 to 4 foot. But you can get chokeberry that is, as tall as 6 feet, 5 foot, 6 feet. So make sure you get what you want, what you need for your site. Of course, they have the early spring blooming, followed by the edible fruit. And then typically very pretty fall color. The 9-bark or Physocarpus. This one is summer wine, which is a dark purple leafed one. There's many 9-bark out there that have green leaves, coppery colored leaves. So you can kind of get what you want. They're kind of open, kind of loose. They do get some dieback. You do have to go in and prune out dead stems over the winter. Not a lot of them, but 1 or 2 or 3, at least on mine every year. Just a note, when you're growing dark leaved or purple plants, that they're going to make everything look darker, and they're going to make the garden look a little bit smaller. And that's okay if that's what you like. They also make they're a background for maybe a lighter blooming flower. They would make a good backdrop for a lighter blooming flower. So, and these bloom May into June. Other shrubs for rain gardens, blue muffin, arrowwood viburnum is recommended. This one particular one is blue muffin. And again, sometimes with viburnums, you need 2 different viburnums to be able to get good fruiting. So when you see those pictures, when you see those pictures of them covered with fruit, just know that you need certain conditions to get that, but it is possible. This arrowwood is about 3 to 5 foot tall, blooms May, like most of the shrubs, kind of an orange burgundy fall color. And then buttonbush is a great one for rain gardens, very, very tolerant of that inundation, very wet soils on the bottom of the rain garden. This one blooms in June. So most of our shrubs not all of them, but a lot of shrubs tend to be spring blooming shrubs. So this one's blooming in June. The summer blooming ones, like some of the spireas, are blooming even a little like July before they start to bloom. So this one fills a void there in June when there's not much else. Cool. Definitely cool flowers. They look like Sputnik if you've never seen them before. This one the species can get, boy, 5 to 12 feet tall. 5 is probably low for the species, but they have these in the rain garden on State Fair grounds in Grand Island, and I've seen those. They're 12 feet tall. And so Sugar Shack is one that's supposed to stay 3 to 5 foot tall. I have it. It's currently probably, yeah, it's 4 to 5 feet tall. So I'm hoping it won't get much taller. I always tell people if a shrub is labeled as getting 3 feet tall, just assume it'll get 5. If it's labeled at 5, assume it'll get 6 or 7. It just seems to be how it goes. Not always. Okay, some Nebraska resources as I kind of wrap up here a little bit. Just some Nebraska resources that we have. If you go to marketplace.unl.edu, there is this extension circular. It's a book. It's only $15 and well worth it because it lists lots of bioretention or rain garden plants that can be planted. It tells when they bloom, what they tolerate, bottom, sides, tops, coloring. It's just a lot of great information. We do have, like I mentioned, the NEB guide, although we created this probably in 2009, and we've since learned there's some plants in there that we might not recommend anymore, like horsetail. But that is available for free download at extensionpubs.unl.edu. And if you do decide that you want to install a rain garden, again, that's sizing, and then just what you do, the soil preparation that you do to make sure that rain garden's going to drain in that 24 to 48 hours. That is pretty critical and important. So we have 2. This is an EC rain garden design, or a ZMAG actually, with some videos embedded in it that has great information on learning how to design and install them. And then just the free download of rain garden design for homeowners. So those are some good resources if you're ready to install a rain garden for all the reasons I mentioned. So I guess I wrap it up there. And you notice here's my rain garden. This is the chamber rain garden, just to let you know. Here's the brown fox sedge. There's the palm sedge, our turtle head. Can't remember, probably the back. This might be the Wichita Falls goldenrod. Not sure what that one with reddish foliage is. Well, I want to say thank you for everybody for joining.